Maritime security invariably will continue to be critical. Together, the Air Force and the Navy will almost surely continue to play an important role in maritime surveillance. What's the best way to structure and equip the Sri Lankan Navy and Air Force to appropriately conduct maritime surveillance? What is the best way to facilitate aerial reconnaissance capability, both for ground and maritime situational awareness? Should UAVs play an increased role? How should responsibilities and resources be allocated? This can be a challenge, delineating missions between and among services, as the U.S. military's discussion in recent years over UAVs illustrates. And of course, what other responsibilities are required? Should, for example, the Navy conduct maritime patrolling further from the Sri Lankan coastline? Personnel. The appropriate size of the military will necessarily stem from how its mission and roles are defined. The Sri Lankan Army, for example, is now composed of more than 200,000 personnel, nearly doubling in recent years. Such a number may need to be readjusted in light of the changed threat environment. The United States military is wrestling with a very similar dynamic. The U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps have grown in size by nearly 100,000 in the last decade. Such decisions are not easy for a host of reasons, not least because militaries can serve as a public employment project, particularly buoyed by difficult fiscal circumstances, as we have in the United States today. This is a perpetual dilemma for post-conflict militaries. Indeed, more than 60 years ago, the Greek military underwent a painful but necessary reduction in its personnel following the defeat of its communist insurgency. While hesitant at first, the Greek leadership was cognizant that the state simply could not sustain, but more importantly, did not need to sustain such a robust force now that the threat environment had changed markedly. More recently, El Salvador's military underwent a comprehensive security sector reform effort, which dramatically changed its force structure, including reducing its military to 1/4 the size of its size during the conflict and disbanding units that were no longer required, and it was relatively successful in doing so. One serious consideration is given to the military's appropriate size. A deftly coordinated demobilization and reintegration effort will be necessary. Importantly, these personnel need to be brought into society as productive members, a difficult process. Given how all-encompassing the conflict with the LTT has been over the years, some element of societal militarization may have occurred. If so, how should it best be stemmed? In Nicaragua, for example, one element of its holistic security sector reform effort included additional resources and support for community-based efforts to deter violence. A slightly less painful way of reducing the Sri Lankan military in the near term could be increased participation in peacekeeping operations. Doing so would enable attrition to naturally reduce the size of the military as long as personnel are not replaced at a comparable rate. Further, participating in peacekeeping missions benefits contributing militaries by providing opportunities to hone certain skills and improve jointness through experience in coalition warfare situations. Importantly, it's worth considering to what extent the Sri Lankan military would be interested in expanding its participation in non-UN peacekeeping operations. Are there other missions that do not fall under a UN umbrella in which the Sri Lankan military might be amenable to participating? The composition of the military is also worth examining in light of the substantial impact a military's composition has on effective security sector reform. Given the limited number of Tamils in the military, and since many security force members do not speak Tamil, is there a need to re-examine its composition and training in order to ensure a representative military? The Lebanese armed forces have made significant strides in this regard, and even though Lebanon's diversity is an order of magnitude more complicated than Sri Lanka's, it's rare to hear arguments that the military is unrepresentative of its populace. National militaries can and often do play an important role in integrating diverse members of a country's population and facilitating a national ethos. Both the Israel Defense Forces and the Lebanese Armed Forces are two notable examples in this regard. Striking a balance between a meritocratic and representative military, which is often necessary in post-conflict environments, is difficult and requires a holistic review of military personnel affairs, including systems of recruitment, promotion, and retirement. Budget. These issues demonstrate that serious consideration is necessary in a post-conflict environment regarding defense funding. What level of investment is appropriate for the Sri Lankan military? Should the defense budget be maintained at the extremely high levels that it has been for years, or is now an appropriate time to reconsider those figures? Politics. Security sector reform is an inherently political and sensitive effort. East Timor took a limited view of security sector reform, and it failed to consider the different and therefore immensely significant political affiliations of its security apparatus elements, rendering it unable to sufficiently reform. In Sri Lanka, the Defense Review Committee, established in 2002 to deal with security sector reform related issues, at times lacked sufficient political involvement. For example, neither the President nor the Commander-in-Chief was involved. An effective security sector reform effort will sufficiently take into account the meaningful role that politics plays. And of course, beyond the military. The Sri Lankan military plays an outsized role in ensuring that Sri Lanka does not return to violence. However, other elements of Sri Lanka's government institutions are critical. For example, Brazil and Colombia have both inhibited violence by facilitating collaboration between and among their security sectors and civilian agencies. Other institutions whose role may seem peripheral to the security sector play a notable role in facilitating or in impeding security sector reforms. In particular, the judiciary, law enforcement, and the legislature are critical actors. In this vein, it is worth considering to what extent the Sri Lankan judiciary requires improvements in terms of its transparency, resource allocation, and distance from politics. Similarly, is the legislature sufficiently involved in and substantively aware of defense affairs? Numerous cases demonstrate that security sector reform, conducted without legitimate, respected judicial and law enforcement sectors, face very real challenges. For example, both Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo failed to develop these institutions sufficiently. This failure has dramatically affected the state's ability to provide security. Such a process, of course, should be grounded in Sri Lanka's unique situation, in sync with its historic and cultural framework, and must receive buy-in from all relevant parties. Looking beyond traditional governmental organizations may offer some unique areas for cooperation. In this vein, the Colombian Ministry of Defense took an intriguing step in conducting its security sector reform effort. The Minister of Defense in Colombia worked with outside actors, including diverse members of the business and academic communities, when Colombia was putting together its national security policy. Such a robust collaborative effort can help enhance the ministry and the military's work. In conclusion, it's worth recalling that Sri Lankan institutions, including in the security sector, command high domestic support. Polls show that Sri Lankans have relatively high confidence in their national institutions, and the majority believe the country is moving in the right direction. Robust security sector reform, as part of a broader reform package, can facilitate this very positive dynamic. And to better position Sri Lanka in a post-conflict environment, both the military and the government would benefit from considering some of the experiences of others in conducting security sector reform. Thank you very much.